Good afternoon, everyone. The study of food, as you've come to discover, encompasses fire and earth, social sciences and statistics, nutrition and health. The study of food is also an exercise in culture. Culture, you might ask, what's culture got to do with it? To which I say, culture is that constellation of practices, beliefs, and sensibilities, of sensitivities to smell and thresholds of desire or thresholds of disdain that prompt some of us to drink our beer icy cold and others among us to drink it at room temperature. Culture is what inspires in some of us a preference for soft, cottony bread, and in others a hankering for the kind of dense, grainy product that gives our teeth a workout. Culture goes beyond economics and statistics, geography and the chemistry of the soil to shape and reflect the ways in which people play with their food. To get at what I mean, let's zero in on America. Let's train our sights on the ways in which profoundly, self-consciously American institutions and practices shape what we eat, how we eat, and when we eat. To put us in the right frame of mind, I'd like to begin today's inquiry into the relationship between food and American culture by screening a clip from a wonderful and vivid documentary by George Motz about America's affection for the hamburger, a film called simply and directly, Hamburger America. In the clip you're about to see, filmmaker Motz visits a popular Memphis burger joint whose way with the humble hamburger is rather singular.
We're at 205 Beale Street in Memphis, Tennessee, the home of the original deep-fried hamburger, Dyer's world-famous hamburgers. If you can only imagine the best, greasiest, tasting, delicious hamburger you've ever had when you needed one the most, that's what it tastes like. A gentleman by the name of Elmer Dyer came up from northern Mississippi to Memphis in 1912 and started Dyer's hamburger restaurant. Well, back then, they didn't have the flat tops and all this, so they cooked in a cast iron skillet. So as you cook more burgers, the grease grows and eventually it becomes a deep fried hamburger. We strain and process our grease daily, but we've never thrown it out and started over. So somewhere in there is molecules from 1912. That's what makes it so good. We take the meat out, roll it into balls, take our spatula and pounder and pound it flat out, scrape it off a marble countertop, and plop it in our 90-year-old grease. It sinks to the bottom and starts to cook around the edges, and pretty soon it floats to the top, and when it floats to the top, it's done. Take it out, take the top of the bun, and go down there and get it. You drain the grease off as much as you can. Of course, it's soaking in the top of the bun. You put it on the mustard, onion, and pickle. Every now and then somebody grumbles there's no lettuce or tomato, and we explain to them why. I could have it. I don't want it because it's not our concept. And that's part of the tradition, and that's part of what the guests like also. An average day at Dyer's on Beale, we probably prepare 300, 400, 500 hamburgers because we sell a lot of the double and triples. You may be getting one burger to your table, but it might have up to 3 patties on it. So it's a lot of hamburger meat. I will not disclose our secret process for seasoning the grease because unless your grease is 91 years old, it's not going to help you anyway. Our t-shirts for our staff ask, have you had your vitamin G today? And the G stands for grease.
I first came to Dyer's, the old one, probably about 20 years ago. It was a wood frame building, had 2 doors. One said colored and one said white. And that's the way it was back then. And you went in and there was just a little stove at one end with a fan up above it. and the fan just kept going all the time, supposedly sucking the grease out, but it was just covered with grease. And these two countertops, these beautiful marble countertops, and he sat there and they flattened the burgers out, and scooped them up, and put them in the grease.
We moved to Beale Street in March of '97. At that time, the current mayor of Memphis, who was W.W. Harrington, still is a great customer, grew up in the area, had a police escort, armored car. The grease was sealed in crime tape, put in the back of the armored car, and police escorted from there to this location.
Sit right here. Sit there, Hampton arrived and cut it up, and we'll go inside and we'll cook what?
When we arrived, we had both the city, county mayors, most of the city council, folks from Good Morning America were here to film the move, and it was broadcast nationally. The old location now has a Vietnamese restaurant in it. I haven't been in there, but I understand the egg rolls are good.
Yummy.
I'm most proud of the fact that people come literally on Beale from all over the world. Table 1 from Germany, table 3's from, England, table 4's from Switzerland. We've had people tell me they've come all the way from China to have our sandwiches. Pride, tradition, and grease. We take pride in what we do. We have tremendous tradition, and it's all about the grease. If you are watching your health at all, I would recommend going next door. We've been doing it for 91 years, so obviously something's working. It's evolved, but yet it's stayed the same. The whole key is the hamburger, deep fried, and the grease, and that's not changed one bit.
So, a high tolerance for grease is not the only thing that renders America's food culture rather distinctive from that of, say, France. Let's explore 2 additional manifestations of America's unique way with food: convenience on the one hand and ethnicity on the other. It's no accident that Americans like to run around in public with a cup of coffee in their hands. That practice comes from somewhere and from something. That Americans also like to run around with a bagel in their spare hand highlights the imprint of ethnicity, of immigrant foods on the American diet. Our world would be considerably impoverished were there no pizza, or Chinese food, or tortillas, or bagels. Bound together, convenience and ethnicity render the United States a very distinctive food culture. Take convenience. These days, mobile foraging, not fine dining, is what characterizes America's relationship to its food. These days, nearly half of all Americans say they eat most of their meals away from home or on the go. What's more, 25% of all Americans order their restaurant meals from a car. More startling still, 1,367 food products that recently debuted in the marketplace featured the word "go" on their labels. America's predilection for movement, or what way back in the 19th century de Tocqueville called restlessness, is nothing new. For much of its history, the U.S. has been a nation continuously on the move, a nation of migrants and immigrants. But the most modern expression of that national trait is one whose roots date back to post-war America, and most especially to the car. The coming of the car changed America, transforming virtually every aspect of daily life, from dress to social relations. Automobility gave rise to the suburbs, furthered the emancipation of women, and it was said, even increased attendance at church, especially among the farmers. In many parts of the country, reported Life magazine in 1946, a car is about as necessary as a pair of legs. Nowhere did the kingdom of the car grab hold of the American imagination more firmly than in Southern California, a place where, quizzically reported one eyewitness, the locals seemed to spend most of their time in their cars. They went to the movies in their cars, they had sex in their cars, and they ate in their cars. Surely it's no coincidence that fast food as we know it, Taco Bell, McDonald's, and above all, In-N-Out Burger, were born of that cultural synthesis of car and appetite, of speed and gratification, that is, Southern California. In that part of the world, observed the celebrated chef and restaurateur Daniel Boulud, as long as you can drive and hold a meal in your hand, you'll be a success. In-N-Out couldn't agree more. Hamburger, no delay, was its motto. Its popular jingle, meanwhile, reinforces the point. In and out, that's what a hamburger's all about. A study in motion, in and out was also a study in pep, a word you don't come across too often these days, and perhaps it's time to bring it back. In and out radiated pep, from the speed with which your meal of a burger and a shake was delivered, to the costumes worn by the staff, a crisp white shirt and an equally crisp white paper cadet hat with sharp angles. Everything crackled with pep. The visual and gastronomic embodiment of a culture that placed a premium on freedom, In-N-Out and its many competitors made it possible for their customers to eat where they wanted and when they wanted and how they wanted, freeing them from the etiquette of the dinner table and from the tyranny of domestic rituals. In-N-Out fueled the self. Ethnicity, or the importation of foreign foods into the American table, had an equally far-reaching impact on what Americans ate. At first blush, ethnicity couldn't be more different than the pep, pep, pep of American car culture. For one thing, ethnicity was far more of an urban phenomenon than a suburban one. Ethnicity was rooted in the city. For another thing, ethnicity had much more to do with shoring up, not tearing down. It's all about tradition, not novelty. And there's more. Ethnicity is entirely bound up with the collective, with the community, with family. Ethnicity, in a word, stands on its head and subverts the values of contemporary American car culture. Even so, its effect on America's eating preferences was just about as far-reaching as that of In-N-Out. Ethnic food originated in longing, in the desire to hold the world at bay. Food, after all, was one of the few arenas that immigrants from Italy and Eastern Europe, China and Japan were not quite so quick to jettison as they adjusted to the demanding rhythms of modern America. Everything else might be up for grabs: language, ritual behavior, religious beliefs, relationships between parents and children, husbands and wives, but not food, not at first. Food held up under the pressures to conform. Food was a source of stability and pleasure and reassurance. Recalling the visits her Chinese-born parents would take to Chinatown, where they would eat themselves silly, Eve Tai allows how these experiences were about feeding the heart, about filling themselves up with reminders of a home they could no longer return to. Finding familiar foods far away from home was not always easy. For all of its bounty, America didn't always have the right stuff, the olive oil, the bok choy, the tomatoes, to satisfy the immigrant palate. In her memoir of growing up Italian in Hoboken, New Jersey, Laura Shinone recalls her dismay upon learning that the cheese used for stuffing her grandmother's celebrated ravioli, that touchstone of authenticity, was none other than Philadelphia cream cheese, rather than a precious import from the Old World. Compounding matters were the efforts of well-intentioned but oh so tone-deaf educators and social reformers who, in the name of integration and Americanization, sought to teach America's newest arrivals how to cook and eat American, wrinkling their noses at the different sets of smells and different ways of constituting a meal characteristic of Italian or Jewish or Chinese cuisine. They gave voice to a kind of disdain for ethnic food that is hard to miss, and to a contemporary sensibility, often hard to stomach. Here, for instance, just one of many, is the response of McClure's magazine, a very popular periodical from 1913, to the affinity with which immigrant Jewish kids had for briny things like pickles. Said McClure's magazine, with the school children of the tenements, the Jewish school kids of the tenements, pickles have become almost a morbid habit, like morphine with certain unfortunate adults. Others, like dietitian Bertha Wood, were only slightly more restrained. Jewish children, she declared categorically in 1922, Jewish children suffer from too many pickles, too few vegetables, and too little milk, leaving them high-strung, overexcited, and very irritable. All too often, the perspective of McClure's or of Bertha Wood were internalized by the objects of their attentions, resulting in the children of immigrants insisting that they wanted to be American, white bread, plain vanilla, and rejecting ancestral notions of order and space. Why can't Chinatowns display sparkling clean counters and neat rows of newspapers and canned goods, lamented the daughter of Chinese immigrants. Most of all, why does Chinatown have to smell? At other moments, immigrant kids gave as good as they got. American literature is full of comments in which immigrants can't abide the cuisine they found at school and at other institutions designed to Americanize them. Anzia Yuzurska, pictured here, her tongue firmly planted in her cheek, put it way back when in the 1920s in her poignant collection of short stories known as Hungry Hearts, said Yuzurska, "You learned us how to do so much. Why can't you learn us how to eat without eating?" For a generation or so, immigrant foods were limited to immigrant neighborhoods. Ultimately, though, as we know from our own experiences, ethnic foods moved beyond the precincts of the barrio and the ghetto, beyond Chinatown and Little Italy, into Main Street. Immigrant foods have become more and more mainstream, more and more American, so much so that we can't imagine our gastronomic landscape without taco stands, pizzerias, delicatessens, and Chinese restaurants. A number of factors help to explain the transformation of the marginal into the mainstream. Chief among them, perhaps, was the realization on the part of corporate America that money was to be had in the commercialization and mass production of ethnic foods. From Goya to Manischewitz and on to Procter & Gamble, corporate America increasingly took note of the dishes it might have once shunned. It wasn't the only one. At a time when ethnic food could only be found in immigrant enclaves, a number of intrepid and adventurous eaters also made a point of enlarging their culinary vocabularies by indulging in foods they didn't have at home. Well before Andrew Zimmern tested the limits of the unfamiliar, a handful of Americans ventured into unfamiliar terrain, hungry for experience. Through word of mouth and in guidebooks such as Ryan James's 1930 Compendium of Good Eats, Dining in New York, they spread the word about the glories of pizza and of pasta and pastrami. These enthusiasts didn't always get things quite right. One of their number, enraptured and puzzled in equal measure by pizza, described it to his friends as an inch-thick potato pancake, sprinkled with Parmesan cheese and just a couple of bits of tomatoes. But no matter. In their zeal to demystify and celebrate, these food enthusiasts also sanctioned and encouraged the consumption of ethnic foods. When in town, make sure to visit Caruso's spaghetti place in Little Italy, said Ryan James to his readers. Or better yet, visit the Jewish quarter of the city. Forget your Broadway and your Park Avenue, he says, his prose spiked with exclamation points. Forget Broadway and Park Avenue. Go east with a vengeance. Go thoroughly east. East Houston, New York's East Side, the ghetto. Word of mouth, the availability of ethnic foods on the grocer's shelf, touristic literature, they all played a part in expanding the range of foods Americans increasingly wolfed down with pleasure. But the factor that most profoundly sped the integration of ethnic foods into the public square was that humble institution known as lunch. We don't often, if ever, think of breakfast, lunch, or dinner as having a history. We tend to assume that these culinary punctuation marks just happen like that. But as it turns out, breakfast and dinner, and most especially lunch, are as much a part of American culinary history as convenience and ethnicity. In fact, lunch is where ethnicity and convenience converge. Lunch, as a recent exhibition at the New York Public Library made abundantly clear, lunch is an artifact of modernity, a hallmark of the fast-paced, time-conscious workaday world we inhabit, a world increasingly governed by the clock and populated by those who come from someplace else. With the growth of cities into trading, manufacturing, and finance centers, eating schedules became codified. No longer could factory hands and office workers return home for lunch or indulge in a leisurely repast. Bringing food from their own kitchens, they ate at their desks or on the street, and sometimes they ate at affordable and inexpensive eateries known as luncheonettes. As the smells of Italian cooking, say, mingled with those of Jewish cooking or Chinese cooking, they generated curiosity and appetite in equal measure. Stephen Sondheim might sing a wry hymn of praise to those ladies who lunch and keep in touch, but the real heroes of our study are those who, whether brandishing a bagel or a pair of chopsticks, taught America by example, making ethnic food increasingly palatable to those who grew up on Wonder Bread. Speaking of the staff of life, Calvin Trilling, one of America's most eminent food writers, once wrote a piece in salute to the bagel. These hard-crusted, endlessly chewy creations, an import from Eastern Europe, which could be eaten on the street, at home, and at the local luncheonette. The bagels were not only the staple food of his daughters, as well as the food of important domestic rituals like Sunday brunch, Trilling pointed out in the pages of the high-toned New Yorker. Bagels, he said with just the right touch of irony, bagels are instrumental in keeping America and American families intact. How do you like that? Thanks.
Professor Weisman, thank you very much. It was a great lecture. Don't tell any other professor. She's my favorite professor.
Oh, you say that to all the girls.
No, first time, right? First time I say that about anybody. And from the day one, before we were thinking about doing this class almost 3 years ago, she was very early on supporting this kind of crazy idea where so many different professors and guest speakers will come to talk about the amazing synergies between food and the world. So, very quickly, because we have Andrew here now, and we want to listen to him, but I had to do this Wikipedia very quickly. So, well, you don't use it? I didn't graduate from university, so I need to do this thing. You know what I'm talking about. So culture, right? The arts and other manifestations of human intellectual achievement regarded collectively. Wow. Tough. But also is the cultivation of bacteria, tissue cells, in an artificial medium containing nutrients. And one seems obviously nothing to do with each other. But if we think for a second, actually they are so related, right? The cultivation of some bacteria. Well, if we are producing cheese, well, that's a lot to do, right? So what we're talking here is about the culture of who we are, right? If we remember one of my favorite phrases from Riyad Sabran, tell me what you eat, and I will tell you who you are. This very much is defining who we are as part of our culture, right? Where we grow up, what our mother or grandmother or father cook for us, or where they will take us to the restaurants. So this is like culture, like bacteria, something that grows on us, right? And sometimes what culture is. Maybe culture has been happening right now here in the smelly Chinatown, because two new Chinese boys that born within a Chinese family that came here are just creating a new wonton of some sort that somehow is going to become the hottest new wonton Washington DC via China ever created by man. And maybe it's only two people that they share that culture, something that has to do with where they come from, where the country they belong. But maybe in 25 years we have 10,000 of those restaurants across the country. Maybe they become part of our new culture. So I was at the Final Four yesterday, and I had a burger. No, not like Andrés burger, but and not like the one we saw. It was actually very beautiful. But it looked good. I was in the basket game, my daughters, And I realized I only ate it because I just saw 2 hours before an ad by a basketball player, one guy very tall, very good, who plays Miami Heat, you know who he is, and you know, who was promoting burgers for a big chain, right? Okay, this is marketing, but this is culture. Burger is culture, right? You go to a basketball game, and it's the burger, right? So that's why I think Andrew is the great guest speaker today, because some guy like Andrew, who watch Andrew on TV? Come on, right? So you know, he doesn't eat testicles because he doesn't have anything else to do. He does it because he's trying to show us a culture of faraway places, or maybe not so faraway places. So I'm not going to tell you the life of Andrew. You can go on your own Wikipedia and find out, because he's a fascinating man that came from a very kind of strange, some people, he will even say dark area. He became who he became because maybe culture, the gastronomic culture put him where he is. But without a doubt, he has an influence of many of us. He has an influence to be bringing us culture, maybe planting the seed to maybe starting the new culture of America. I don't know through his programs what is going to be remaining in 10, 20, 30, 50 years from now. But if somebody is having an influence in culture, it's people like him. So he will be more like pop culture, and that's what we're going to be listening about. So thank you for coming. I don't think that's how we do it now, because we are all from here, but he took a plane only to be here 1 hour with us, and he's going back. So I love him for that.
Thanks, Jose. How's everyone doing today? Good. Professor, great talk. I wish I had attended college now. I would be a much better student. I was one of those people who probably should have taken a few years off before I went to school, but it profoundly influenced what I do and how I do it, because I think I approach some of the things that I'm most well known for with an eye to entertainment, because I want to be relevant and I want to expose a larger group of people to some of the ideas that we talked about earlier today, that you've heard about in this course over the last couple of months. But I also want to put out very serious ideas. I tend to have to be reminded in my show by my field producers to sort of not be so serious, which if you watch my show is kind of weird. But I do think that food and culture define each other in a beautiful and very simple way. You've heard several different definitions of it. I agree with all of them. There was a silly part of me that wanted to get everybody out of their seats, take them literally next door. Do you know what's next door? Wrong. A tiny little dry cleaner that started then to sell sodas and coffee and other stuff and is now a dry cleaning and convenience store. And on their little sign in the window as I was grabbing my coffee and coming back from my Starbucks run, because I have to have my coffee in hand at all times, kimchi. And I almost went in there because obviously it's a Korean, it's the only ethnic food item that they sell, and it's advertised. I'm like, those are the places that have good kimchi. I firmly believe in that, because somebody is making it and bringing it from home. It's gray market kimchi. I doubt very much whether it's something that's mass produced and that is available other places. And to me, that is the essence of what our culture is. I grabbed my coffee. I learned something fascinating about coffee. I'm obsessed with coffee. Jose talked about the dark place. I've been sober for 22 years, so the only chemical that I put into my system besides what's in food is coffee, and so I have a lot of caffeine. I love coffee, love the flavor of it, and have developed a fondness for bitterness and the flavors and complexities of coffee over my years as a culinarian. And I was talking with a French friend about it, and we're talking about the destruction of global culture by Americans, something that I'm going to touch on that, which is both true and a myth at the same time. But he pointed out to me that everywhere else in the world, people leave their office, space is different. Americans show up at work with 20 ounces of coffee and plunk it on their desk in their cubicle and sort of cut themselves off from the rest of the world. If you go to other parts of the world, especially in Western Europe, people are much more integrated at work, and every 75 or 80 minutes they grab each other and they go downstairs to a little shop and they have a very short cup of coffee. You can call it what you want in any one of a million languages, whether it's Buna in Ethiopia or an espresso in Italy. And you sip and you talk and you do business, or you meet your spouse or your friend from their job and you socialize for a couple minutes, actually share life, and then go back to work. It is that easier sort of notion that we all talk about with culture, the things that we aspire to, the things that we want to be participating of. We sort of have this utopia that we all aspire to, that we sit there with our 20 ounces of coffee, hustling along on our phones, immersed in ourselves, and wonder what it is that we're missing. I like to go around the world and show people what they're missing, because I think that we can learn a lot of things. I grew up in the 60s and 70s in New York City. And I grew up in the city where, once a week my dad would take me down to Chinatown to a restaurant called Bobo's, and it was like going to a foreign land. And it changed my life, and my father's stories of traveling changed my life, and I begged him to take me with him, and I traveled a lot. And I think that's why I do what I do. I studied art history and history at Vassar College, and I remember my first day in Art History 101 that Madam Koretsky put a slide up on the screen, and it was, I forget who it was some Northern European portrait master, 17th century, and it was a woman, and she was by a window. I really should look it up and find out which slide that was. Be pretty easy to. There was a bowl of fruit and a dog and a window, and through the window you could see a couple boats, and she asked everybody to write down on a piece of paper what they saw. And everyone wrote down the same 10 things, and except for one person who went on to become a famous art dealer. And she then spent the next 45 minutes going through this painting and explaining. She was like Sherlock Holmes. There's a banana. I didn't notice there was a banana and an orange in the bowl of fruit. And, in 17th century Holland, what is now Holland, there was no banana trees or orange trees, right? It had to come from somewhere. She was wealthy. And Madame Koretsky just sort of walked through all the possibilities. And as my food life developed and as my academic life developed, I really wanted to be able to tell the same thing about culture that Madame Koretsky could by looking at a painting, by staring into a bowl of soup. And so I was really appreciative of the way you tied all that together for me. It was just absolutely beautiful. That's what I do because I want to tell those stories. I'm guilty of several things as I romp around the world, and I wish I had. I'm not the person who presents such a beautiful set of ideas. I like to sort of shotgun blast everything at you and then do some nice Q&A in the couple minutes we'll have left at the end of this. But I suffer in an attempt to make a show, trying to rid people of the idea of contempt prior to investigation. I want us to be accepting of other cultures, right? I think the key to our success as a global humanity is to, in an ever-flattening world, be accepting of other people and other cultures. We spend too much time arguing about the things that we don't have in common. Different skin color, different language, different sexuality, different religion, different politics, as opposed to uniting about the things that we do have in common. And I believe that in that commonality is our solution to getting along with other people in the rest of the world. And that's sort of like the higher mission that I have with my show. I don't expect you to go out tomorrow and eat a jewel beetle, but I do expect the next time you're confronted with a vegetable you don't like, you might be a little more accepting of it, and then you might be a little more accepting of a person who doesn't speak your language or have your same viewpoint. And I think, it's the great thing about the American university system, is that we sort of I learned about other people at college. I went to a precious little private school in New York where everyone smelled the same, looked the same, tasted the same. It was awful. Great, but awful. So in an attempt to tell stories whose point is to rid you of the notion of contempt prior to investigation, sometimes I'm really guilty of it. And it's a nice little swing into the food thing here. I don't know how many of you saw my Namibia show, but one of my favorites, and when I was planning to go to Namibia and I was going to be living with one of the many lost tribes, I've had the privilege of spending a week each with 7 of the 12 lost tribes in our world, and I was going to spend a week with the Himba, and I was just thrilled about it, so I wanted to learn all about them. And the first thing that happened when I Googled them was that I found that there was a giant hydroelectric dam that the Angolan and Namibian governments were going to put on the border, and they were going to cut off a couple of rivers, and it was going to take some traditional pastoral lands of the Himba away from them, right? So this is like, I mean, it was like Norma Ray, right? The old Sally Field movie. I mean, I was going to go to Namibia and confront every government official I could, because we went a couple years ago. The show was already in 70 countries. I knew the politicians would be there at the airport to greet me, and I was going to save the Himba. That was going to be my legacy. I would be the Himba savior. I would stand in front, I would chain myself to the dam, right? And, or, I do, none shall pass. I mean, I was going to be a global hero. And I did a lot of research on it, and, the pastoral people, thousands of years, going from 7 or 8 farms. The Himba, by the way, are the tribe with the women that paint themselves in red ochre and have the hair and all the jewelry and spend 6 hours a day getting themselves ready to come out of their huts because they have to look absolutely perfect, and all of them are like 6 feet tall and stunningly gorgeous and amazingly strong. They're just, Amazonian that way in the comic book sense. And the husbands say they take many wives, but the Himba women say they just have a rotating group of husbands, which is more the case because, like most paternalistic societies, the women really run things. And the men go from village to village to village with their herds, and they interpret their wealth by how many kids they have and how many wives. And the women, though, are the ones that wear the jewelry and the hair, and it actually symbolizes what their husbands have and designates status. And fascinating people. And I'm like, they're going to be wiped off the face of the earth because this dam is going in there, and things are going to be ruined forever. And so it took us 3 days to get to the Himba, and we get to them, and for a day they didn't really speak to me, because in the tribal world, you have to work very hard to become accepted. I'm a pretty soft, pudgy guy on my couch in Edina, Minnesota, where I live. But when I'm out in the world, I am a daredevil and a risk taker, and I do things that shock the crap out of me on a regular basis. But I like the version of myself when I travel best of all. I'm more curious, and I want to know what you're all about, and I want to learn things, and I like me better when I'm traveling. It's the transformative power of travel, and I take some of that back with me whenever I come home, and I grow as a human being because I travel. And I get to the Himba, and they accept me pretty fast because I was dragging firewood, and I killed a goat, and I built our own shelter for us to sleep in the first night. And so if you show in the real tribal world, you're measured by your flirting skills, your fire building skills, your hunting skills, your cooking skills. If you can't provide in the tribal world, you are pushed to the side. And so you have to provide right away. And they accepted us, and in a fascinating conversation with them, they pointed at some German news people who were taking pictures of them from their van about 100 yards away, and translated through my guide, they said to me, "What is it with the other journalists? They just come here and park and take pictures of us. How awful is that?" I mean, they're really insulted. They don't come and learn who we are or what we do. That's why we like you. You learn who we are and what we do. And I told them I was going to save them from this dam. And they kind of looked at me and mumbled something and walked away. And I figured, I brought up a touchy subject. thank God I'm here with my New York City, left-wing, Lindsay liberal, Jewish guilt, American, white guy saving, the African tribal peoples. It was just, looking back on it, was just awful. Because I forgot the most important question, which was asking them what they wanted. So the second day I wake up in Himbaland, we spot some wild animals coming at us from the horizon, and I grab my cameraman and I told him to put his telephoto lens on because it was more powerful than our binoculars, and I couldn't really deal with the binoculars. I said, "What is that on the horizon?" And he thought they were ostriches, and then they got closer, and it turned, because there's all that heat moray on the horizon, very hot where we were, and it turned out it was school children. And the school children were listening to music on their headphones. And I noticed after a while there were SpongeBob SquarePants backpacks. And there were T-shirts from some, high school in Colorado that had packed up a bunch of stuff and sent it to their school. And I asked the guys, where are those children coming from? Thinking that they're probably being chased by the dam builders or something. And he said, they're coming from school. They go to school 3 days a week and they sleep there, and so they do school all once, then they come home. And I saw that the children were extremely westernized, but the parents were all wearing loincloths and not distinguishable from the way their ancestors had lived thousands of years ago. And I sat down and I finally realized maybe I would ask the Himba about the dam. And so I asked the head of the tribe, and he said to me, "Oh, we're so excited. We see what our children are learning and what they're capable of, and they've showed us pictures of the world around us." By the way, this was a man who on camera asked me how I would find my way home if I didn't know how to navigate by the stars, because that's how he walked around from place to place, by aligning mountains and stars and seasons, okay? So he was living, really living in a way that was indistinguishable from his ancestors, couldn't understand how I would physically find my way home, was very concerned about me after he became fond of me. He actually gave me one of his daughters as a wife. At the time, I had a 14-year-old wife in Himbaland. I don't know what she's up to now. We didn't stay in touch. But the point is that here was a guy who was firmly feet planted 1,000 years ago, who desperately wanted his children to have a different way of life because he had seen a glimpse of the future. The Himba were completely capable of making a decision on their own. In fact, when I looked at some of these guys in loincloths, each one of them is a doctor, an architect, an engineer, a chef, a chemist, right? They don't go anywhere for anything. They all live to be 75, 80 years old. Their skill set, the tribal skill set, is immense. I was bringing my own predisposed judgment to it, which was a very, very fascinating sort of learning curve for me. I was obsessed with that same idea that the professor was talking about, that automobility, that driving of self. I had my cultural blinders on that I worked so hard to take down all the time. I was as guilty of it then as I've ever been. And it changed my way of looking. That experience was transformative, like a lot of travel is for me. It changed the way that I look at the world. And I started to look at other experiences that I've had and where they were similar and where they were dissimilar, but where the commonality was. We were talking about, you were talking about ethnicity, and I was reminded of my experiences in Vietnam and the Philippines, two places with changing food culture, and China as well, drastically Americanized. Do you know what the most popular restaurant in Xi'an, China is? KFC. The first one is booked out, 5,000 years. You can't get in for a wedding at a KFC, which, by the way, is the most popular place to have a wedding in Xi'an, a fairly progressive Chinese city of 8 million people, probably more by now. I don't know how many of you saw my Vietnamese and Philippine shows, but the one thing they all have in common is that thing that you were talking about with families sitting around and the grandparents putting out this array of foods for me, saying, here's our culture, you are what you eat, right? And they lay out this incredible food for us, and we taste it, and their children taste it and go, oh yeah, I remember this, reminds me of my childhood, it's so much fun. And the grandkids are sitting there playing their iPhones, take a bite of grandma's spicy 3-day-old rotted squid and bolt out the door. Where are they going? Friend's house, Haagen-Dazs and McDonald's, and they listening to grandmothers in the Philippines and Vietnam. I think I spent half my time in those countries listening to grandmothers complain about the Americanization of their food life. This in tiny little villages. I'm not even talking about big cities. Our world has flattened immeasurably and so quickly. And ideas are exchanged quicker and quicker and quicker. And sadly, in our country, what's hot amongst, or ironically, what's most popular in America right now, by some definition food-wise, is the food of those countries. And what food of those countries is the stuff that's most popular now? It's not the chicken chow mein of my grandparents' era, which is what they went downtown to Chinatown to eat. It's the sizzling, crispy intestine Chengdu hot pot, because people like, myself and our friend Tony Bourdain and other people show you that on TV, and people taste it and they go, oh my gosh, that's really good, and chefs, from Chris Cosentino in San Francisco to April Bloomfield in New York have popularized the food of what's called the fifth quarter, right? All the pluck. The stuff that was eaten by everyone in the world first and foremost, because you had to. The meat could be salted and smoked or put up in some way. Bones and hide could be saved or preserved in some way to be made into tools or stuff later. But the blood, the lungs, the heart, the liver, the intestine, the reproductive organs, all had to be eaten right away, right? So every country in the world had a dish. Every country in the world has a dish traditionally where that stuff is boiled up and ground, sometimes combined with some grain, and stuffed inside one of the other organs and smoked or dried or cooked again to be eaten in a mobile fashion, because everyone at one point was mobile, hunters and gatherers, right? It's amazing how what was once popular is now popular again. Every country has that dish. The Scottish call it haggis, right? The Icelanders and Scandinavians call it slaughter. We have a million different names for those sausages and things. It's called hogpants in Louisiana and came from Germany. We live in a world where everything endlessly repeats itself, but ever so slightly, I think, because I'm an optimist, gets better and better and better, because we are now so flat that we have taken the information that we've learned about today and that you've learned about in this course about how we've sped up and mechanized our food system, but never before in the history of the world has a civilization been more engaged with food, real food, than ours is right now. Despite 1 in 5 children going to sleep hungry at night, despite 20% of people having lining up at a window to get their meal to go. That's staggering. Despite all those kind of things that at one point are shuddering, I'm an eternal optimist, because I've seen too many things that we're eager to adopt from other countries. The fact that right now people want to go into restaurants and they want to have the sour lung soup at some swanky New York City gastropub. I mean, yeah, I think it's repugnant that it's $20 a bowl, and I think it's awful that eating well in America has become a class privilege. But you want to know something? We're going through a cycle where that's changing. And we have a lot of people. The fact that we have so many people in this room headed out into the world to become evangelists for creating a different and better food world, armed with everything that you've learned here about food and culture this semester, to me is it's why I show up here, because when my friend Jose says, can you come help us out? I say yes right away. But I'm addicted. You can't get me to not come back next year, because the opportunity to present ideas and listen to what you guys are doing, because I think your generation are the ones that are going to save our planet, my planet, for my kid who's 9, he's younger than you, is that to me is very important. There's no greater thing than talking to you about this subject. I'll leave you with a thought because then I want to save some time for question and answer. So please tell me it's not yet 5 o'clock or just about?
No, it's 10 till.
10 till, perfect. We were talking about things that are popular. Most popular, my wife came to me the other day and said, we're going paleo. I like bread. I want bread. It's probably not good for my waistline. But we're now trying to do this paleo thing. I cheated today. I had a Dunkin' Donut coming off the plane because I haven't had a carb in 4 days. Freaking awful. And I was on vacation with my wife and we were in Costa Rica and it's like, we can eat fish and fruit all day long. And I was just like, oh my God. I would go off with my son horseback riding or walking down the beach and there's street food and it's like, oh my gosh, an arepa, thank God. I'm the worst person. This isn't recorded, is it? My favorite show, they just rebroadcast it the other night. Their Travel Channel doesn't have a lot of great shows right now. They're about to. There's a whole bunch of great. By the way, George Motes, my buddy George, who did Hamburger America, has a show on Travel Channel. They're showing, they've gone to Bizarre Foods 5 nights a week. And the good thing about that is that a lot of my favorite shows that they never rebroadcast are being rebroadcast again. So look for my Botswana show or some of these tribal shows. For some reason, they don't like to show them a lot because they're a little too intellectual. But for you guys, they're solid gold. But the Botswana show is really, really amazing. We're borrowing, I'm at the line at Whole Foods the other day buying paleo stuff. And I'm looking at the magazine rack at Whole Foods, and there's a magazine called Simple, right? And there's another magazine called Retro Hippie Paleo Person. And it's just all these sorts of things. That's horrible. If there are any retro paleo hippie people here, I apologize. That's unfair. But the point is, everything that's worshipped in the tribal world is on these magazines. I have this idea about modern pioneering that my friend Giorgia Pellegrini just wrote a book about it called Modern Pioneering. But I've been talking about it for a long time. I think we've lost touch as someone who's soft and mushy, and I'm a hypochondriac Jewish New Yorker in my 50s. I think I'm upset that we no longer know how to win a fist fight or, seduce someone or build a fire or kill your own food and cook it. And I'm not a survivalist or a prepper or anything like that. Apologies to survivalist preppers in the room. Prep and survive all you want. To me, it gets a little freaky. But I think you need to know how to do all those things. I think we've lost touch with this sort of elemental part of who we are. And it's becoming popular again to reconnect with that. There are these mutter things. There's probably someone here who's done one of these mutter races. Amazing. I attempted to do one a month ago and failed miserably. But my trainer thought it would be a good idea for me to fail and it would energize me, which it did. But the point is that even how we exercise is no longer about the gym and shiny equipment. It's about going out and doing stuff, right? And that's a very tribal sort of notion. They don't exercise because they're always running and moving. I'll give you a few snapshots of the person that I would most like to be like. I would like to be a Juntoisi, average Juntoisi tribes person. These are the Bushmen of the Kalahari that live in Botswana, in the Aha Hills. I'm obsessed with them. Many think of them as the world's first people. They were the ones who walked out of a swimming hole and searched for more fat for their brains, and I adore these people. When they go out hunting, they have no individual possessions. They share everything. So they have this tree in the middle of their little camp, and they hang the little bag that has the bow and arrows on these flightless little mini arrows that have a poison in them that they cook the poison from leaves and a certain worm. Creates this deadly poison. There's no known cure. It can kill an elephant. They never use it. It's like their nuclear weapon, except that we've used ours. When they hunt, okay, I'm sitting there starving. I need meat. All I've been doing is living in their seasonality, in their obsessiveness about their seasonality. Marula fruit were falling from the marula trees. And so all they eat until all the marula fruit are gone are marula fruit, and they take the nuts of the marula fruit, which are pretty big like a chestnut, and they roast them in the fire. And they mash that nut with jewel beetles, and they make this like protein paste that looks like the world's first health bar, and it's just god-awful, but it's got everything you need to survive. And they have that and marula fruit all day long. And they'll eat that for days until there's no more marula fruit. And then that gets them to the next week when the wild grasshoppers are out and this other berry is out. And then it gets them to the next week where the wild African porcupine is mating, and so they're active. And these porcupine, by the way, are like Princess Bride rodents of unusual size. They're massive. I'm not kidding. It's like an 80-pound porcupine, and they hunt them, but I kept saying, are you going to use the arrows? And they're like, no. It's much more fun to go out at night and track them and then crawl into the holes that these burrows underground and pull them out. It's like wrestling with a wild animal that one touch of, a porcupine that's 80 pounds has massive quills. Like you could die impaling yourself on its skin. They think it's fun. There were these big, I love kudu, fairly decent sized antelope. I love oryx, really big antelope, African. The meat's unbelievable. They're just walking through the camp. And I'm like, why don't we kill one? They're like, they're too big. What do you mean they're too big? You dress it out. I hunt. 70, 80 pounds of meat. This is great. Everyone gets fed. We'll all eat for a couple days off. This is unbelievable. We'll smoke some. We'll roast some. We'll cure. This is unbelievable. Too big. We like a smaller animal. If we find a small one, we'll hunt it. How do you hunt the small one? Do we get to use the bow and arrow? Absolutely not. How do you hunt it? Do you go after it with the spears and go into the burrows like you do with the porcupines? Absolutely not. I should tell you, by the way, they live in a hardscrabble desert that's almost uninhabitable. It's 120 degrees. Our insurance people had a security person with us who wouldn't let us leave the camp without 5 containers of water on our bodies at any time in case you got lost, because you can die so quickly from dehydration there. These guys only drink water in the afternoons and in the evenings. Okay, they'll go all day running and hunting, just eating these little berries that I found out later are like their version of Red Bull. It just keeps them going and all buzzed and happy. How they hunt deer, antelope, and other hoofed animals is by outrunning them. 3 of them, usually teenagers, will string out in a line, and then they'll all run and pick up sticks and stones and throw it so the deer, and they'll get the deer to run to a place where it's trapped against a rock face or a cliff or a thicket of thorns or something the deer can't go to, and then they walk up to it and strangle it. So I asked them how long this takes. They're like, sometimes an hour, sometimes 6 hours, sometimes all day. They do it for fun, running nonstop 3, 6, 9 hours in 120 degree heat in the desert, okay? That's how their preferred way, perfect balance with nature, eating what nature takes from them. They don't want to kill bigger animals because it's wasteful. It's wasteful. We ate the porcupine. I'm like, all right, we're going to taste the meat. They cooked the fat, like a big carpet of skin, threw it on the fire and broke off little pieces and put the meat up in a tree so it would dry in the sun because we're going to make soup with it the next morning. Then we ate off of that all day long. The most amazing culture, living in perfect balance with themselves, much in the way that some of us online at Whole Foods sit there and go, yeah, that sounds right. I'd like to exercise and eat seasonally and just take what nature gives me. If you read any magazine with a prescriptive bent about lifestyle and food today, that top line of how the Juntoisie live their life is how we aspire to be. And we're sitting here, paying $25 in a restaurant for a bowl of braised stomach and intestine. in a fancy pants Italian restaurant. It absolutely boggles my mind. The last thing I want to mention. The ironies in this subject to me are staggering. I've accidentally stumbled upon several of them in my ramshackle presentation today. I was listening to NPR the other day, and there was a professor from Columbia or NYU, I forget which, named Dr. Wu. And I don't know if any of you caught it, I forget the program. But he was talking about those ironies and about speed and mobility, and knowing that I was coming here, it was just on a couple days ago, and knowing that I was coming here and knowing what the professor's presentation was going to be about, something he said sparked a tremendous amount of interest in me that may be of interest to you. In our attempt to make life more convenient for us, we sometimes make big mistakes and blunders. I think we correct ourselves out of them, but we make big mistakes and blunders. One of the side effects of speeding up and modernizing our food system in America is concentrating too much power into the hands of too few, right? And I know that you guys have talked about this before and read about it. We all swim in this language. But it's harmed our system, and it's created an unhealthy food system and unhealthy people and juvenile diabetes and overweight. I mean, just, we can extend it all, and now we're realizing that it's much better to eat more seasonally, produced locally, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that we've gotten out of balance. In our zeal as Americans to go all the way over here, we really should have dialed it back somewhere over here. And he mentioned a very, very simple, and some of you are actually too young to remember it in your own life, because you probably weren't writing a lot of letters to friends when you were 8 years old. But he, in the days before email, people would, use their telephone and cell phones. You'd make a couple calls a day. You'd write a couple letters a week. I mean, it wasn't really a big deal. It wasn't like, those old movies with people with white wigs taking out the big feather and dipping in the inkwell and doing correspondence all day long. You talked to other people, and you lived in a more shut-off kind of world, in a sense. You navigated around life on your feet and in your car, and you interacted with other people in a much different way. So in an attempt to communicate with people faster and accomplish more things and free our lives up to do more, we've all gotten addicted to our cell phones and email. We don't use our phones to talk on them as much as we do to text on them. I never spent 3 hours a day doing letter writing at any point in my life, but I spend 3 hours a day doing email. And this professor was talking about it in terms of the tyranny of tiny tasks. He says it's not the big stuff, it's the adding up of all the little stuff. In an attempt to solve one problem, we create another one. As I said before, I think the cures to all of those little problems, the cures to the tyranny of tiny tasks, are found by exploring other cultures, because I think in them and in comparing their cultures to ours, we're able to make some smart decisions and navigate our own lives better. I really think that since the earth is flatter, we might as well be learning and accepting more of other people's ideas and applying them to our own lives. And I think exploring the ideas that surround the relationship of food and culture is the best way to start. Because at least for me personally, the way I can interpret the world best is by staring into the bowl of soup that's in front of you. So in the short time that we have left, I really am interested in hearing what you guys have to say. It's a requirement that I talk for a certain amount of time, but and I'm not even sure we necessarily need the microphone, but you probably do because you're recording it. Yes. Getting the head shake, yes. But I would love to hear from anyone on this subject or any other. I mean, there might be someone who wants to ask me something crazy about my television show, and that's fine. But I really do want to hear what's on your mind based on what the professor and I talked about today. And I thank you very, very much. And by the way, a huge thank you to everyone involved at GW and this course in particular for having me today. It's absolutely one of my favorite things in the world to do because nobody likes to hear themselves talk more than I do me. Questions, comments, concerns, support, deny, refute? What do you got? Bring it. You guys are supposed to be smart. Blow me away.
Hi. So throughout this course, we've learned a lot about the problems in the food industry in the United States, and I was just wondering if you ever compromise your experiences for ethical reasons, or how you go about dealing with those sorts of problems.
Can you be a touch? I think I know what you mean, but like when you say compromise my own ethics.
Well, say, for instance, the meat industry and all the problems that we've seen with that.
Sure.
Do you ever avoid or choose to eat organic specifically? Or
Absolutely. I mean, it's a huge issue. The longer that I've been around, the more resolute in my principles I've become. And I think that's a function of age, and I think it's a function of a sense of responsibility, community responsibility. The early parts of my life, 1 to 10, I was just an angel. 10 to 35, I was the most selfish, self-centered person you could possibly imagine. Me, 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 me. The last 18 years have been a lot different. And it's interesting, both professionally and personally, I feel a greater sense of civic responsibility than I ever had. Increasingly, I spend more and more time doing charitable work and trying to talk about these issues, and it was very disingenuous at first to be saying one thing and doing another, and then when you become a parent, it becomes even worse. So some of that's just a factor of growing up. I can't tell my kid about food problems and try to talk to him about how to be a good citizen without doing the same thing, and I mean that word with a small c, and in every, or capital C, in every sense of the word. So I do try to cheat, all the jokes aside about cheating on the paleo thing, I like to have a street hot dog in New York City when I go to New York. I just do. And I'm a lotus eater, I'm a pleasure seeker, and I'm a product of my own society. So do I cheat and compromise those vows? You bet I do. I'm not perfect. However, everywhere, when we shop with an eye towards putting the best food. I try to support local farmers. I try to eat seasonally. I try to do all those things in my life because I want to align my principles with, what I say with what I do. I'm not 100%. I think it's almost impossible to be that way, but I believe very strongly in doing that. And I will say I'm very careful about where I spend my money that way. I'm not talking about the $2 hot dog on the street that I don't know where the meat comes from. It's like my grandmother kept kosher, and every Sunday night we would have Chinese food, and my father would go pick her up in the cab and bring her over to our house, and she'd have her glass of sherry, and we'd walk 3 blocks to the Chinese restaurant around the corner from my house. And my strict kosher grandmother would always have one of the fantail shrimp off the appetizer that everyone else was eating. It was just these like fried, crispy fantail shrimp at the restaurant, and she would always have a couple nibbles of a dish called Ho Yu Gai Pu. I remember it. I remember everything about that dish at Richard May's King Dragon on 73rd and 3rd Avenue in New York City. This is in the 60s, and it had sliced roast pork in it. And when I was older, I asked my dad, how does grandma, she was president of Mount Naboa Sisterhood, the temple around the corner from Zabar's, for 40 years. I said, how does this woman justify that? And he just looks, he says, I don't know, but don't ask her. And I realized as I've gotten older, that was her moment. It was as if God gave her permission at Richard May's King Dragon. I feel that way about the hot dog on the streets of New York. Everything else is, I try to be as, and I will also say I've made it the center point of my storytelling, certainly the last 3 or 4 years. The show's been on 8.5 years. We're broadcast in 70 countries, and it's radically different now than it was before. If you look at an episode from last season with an episode from the first season, the political, societal, cultural statement making, I actually showed a map of Kurdistan, a country that technically doesn't exist, on my show on Monday night, and freaked the anti-Islamists out. I mean, freaked them out. I mean, it was like a Twitter uproar, and I'm still dealing with the fallout from that, but I felt it was really important. There's a displaced Kurdish population in Nashville, and I did a story on them. We would have told that story differently years ago, but now that it's a successful show and I have some weight, I think it's my responsibility to tell those stories and to put it out there and to be more vocal. And it's probably not fair of me, but you know, I give a lot of shit to a lot of people who have TV shows who don't use their platform for some good. If you have tens of millions of people watching you on TV and you're not putting out some good, I mean, I make an entertainment show, but if you're not doing something with that entertainment, what are you doing? It just feels oily and smarmy to me. So I try to do the right thing, I guess, is the best way to answer that question in 10 minutes. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Okay, so you alluded a little bit to the idea that eating healthy was now just something that is exclusively allowed to those who have the material wealth to do so. And you kind of made all those jokes about how you can go to these nice restaurants and you can get all of these ethnic foods, but it's exorbitantly expensive. But I noticed that you said that we're kind of going in cycles, so I'm really interested to see what you think that's going to be coming next.
And it's kind of overlapping. And you're right, I generalized a little bit unfairly to make a point. But no. Everything is always in flux, and two things can be true at the same time. While that is happening, and because I make this point in my show, you go into this fancy restaurant and they're doing Peruvian food, and it's costing you $100 to have this incredible Peruvian seafood meal, and and you go 5 miles down the road in Los Angeles, and you go to a neighborhood with a lot of Peruvian immigrants, and you can have a nearly identical meal for like $10, right? So these two things are true at the same time. We're fetishizing that food in this fancy pants food world where we broadcast these ideas to a large number of people. And at the same time, you can eat well inexpensively in a lot of ethnic restaurants for the exact reasons the professor was detailing. I mean, it's just the food of immigrants. There's people don't have a lot of money, and where we feed new communities of immigrants with subsequent waves of that immigration, there's great value to be found. So there's, it's like tectonic plates. They're sliding across each other, and occasionally there's a quake and the landscape changes. But that's how I like to look at it, like shifting tectonic plates. I do think that as food, as we go through over the next 20, 30 years, there is a whole generation of people who are exposed to a food life who are never going to be chefs, but they're radical evangelists for the things that culinary people have believed in for generations. Pro-farmer, socially conscious. I mean, you just add the list up ad nauseum. All of you people, I mean, some of you may get into the restaurant business, but you're just so much aware of the issues around food that for 2 generations, we were immune to. We didn't hear about it. 100 years ago, everyone was related to someone who made a living off the land. Life was different. We were churched differently. We ate differently. We had to eat seasonally. I mean, the car changed things. Yes, the railroad changed things in the 19th century almost as drastically as the car did in the 20th, but things have sped up so much faster, right? We've grown more in the last 20 years than the previous 200, that whole idea. I really think that breaking down the barriers of class around food, which I think it's coming. I think I'll see it before I die, and returning to a different way of looking at food where it's more healthily positioned will happen, barring some earth-shaking calamity, barring World War III, barring the asteroid or some other sort of cataclysmic event, which sadly seems to be able to happen. The whole world changed on 9/11. I mean, it's like things froze for a while with a global shift. Because of things happen. But if everything sort of goes on trend and we have the same sort of economic cycles and ups and downs, I really do, I'm an optimist. I really do think we're changing for the better. We're going to learn an awful lot about ourselves. Your generation is going to restore some balance to that food life. So as far as access, health and wellness, I mean, right now, eating well, you don't have to be necessarily rich, but you have to have some free time too. I mean, I sit there and I find myself writing articles about both sides of my mouth. It's like, it's easy to cook simply and well and fast and set yourselves up, and then I'm actually out in the world and I meet people who are like, I work 2 jobs, my husband works 1 job, we still have to deal with the kids. I mean, we do fast food 3 nights a week. You know, now luckily, people whose only vision, because a lot of it's an education and access issue, remember how important education is, they get educated because they turn on the TV and they're just reminded, I don't need to go and buy a Happy Meal for my kid for $4 or $5. I can go down the street and take my 2 kids and split that enormous bowl of ramen with meat and vegetables for $10, right? I mean, that's what's happening in Minnesota right now. And that's a progressive sort of idea, but it's happening all over. And I'm seeing it, the mobile thing. I mean, Jose's got a food truck, I have a food truck. We're going into neighborhoods and doing food at cost. You know, we can't afford to do it any other way because then my truck's out of business, but we're trying to figure out a way to put trucks and make them charitable entities. Rather than having General Mills spend billions of dollars on advertising, how about they just spend a couple $100,000 a year and sponsored my truck and just put it out there to feed people? Just as an education and awareness raiser. It's not that I'm gonna give everyone fresh food, because I can only serve 150 meals a night or whatever off the truck, but what if all those people, it opened their eyes and made them more aware? And I think that those ideas are getting enough traction. Yeah. Yeah, shout it out. Why do I hate walnuts? I'm allowed to hate one thing, right? They're just soapy. I just don't like them. I mean, I love pecans. I like every kind of nuts. I even like Brazil nuts, but I don't like walnuts. I don't like oatmeal. I don't like raw cookie dough. Can't do it. Just can't do it.
3 things.
There's 3 things. That is 3 things. Yes.
I'm not sure if you've done a show in DC or not, but what would you recommend for bizarre foods in DC?
What would I recommend for bizarre foods in DC? I did do an episode in DC. Bizarre, Jose was talking about the definition of culture, which I love, by the way, I'm stealing that. But bizarre is defined by Webster's as, the second definition is unique or interesting. And that's what I've tried to, I had to have a hook. The network, I made a Faustian deal. The show I presented to Travel Channel was something that they said is better for PBS, and you'll make 13 of them and you'll be fondly remembered, but that'll be it. And they said, but if we tweak it a little and put a little more entertainment in it and broaden the definition, and I went back and reworked the show and presented it again, and they bought it. When I did my DC show, we did some crazy, that snakefish that's in the water here. We went to some Ethiopian restaurants. I went to some little cafes that were still making, chitlins, and we did a really, really great show. I ate with Senor Jose Andrés, and we did some fantastic stuff at his restaurants because I wanted to stretch the boundaries. In some of our shows, I'm sitting there putting god-awful things in my mouth to make one point. In some of my other shows, especially in the American ones, I've tried to broaden the definition a little to provide and provoke some interesting ideas amongst people about what's all around them. My favorite part of my DC show was probably the Korean food that we did and the Salvadoran. There's a huge Central American population here. And the pupusa meal with the 3 Salvadoran ladies who cooked together in the high heels and the boobs with the deep frying was unbelievable. I mean, that just blew my mind. Yeah.
Have you ever refused to eat anything, and have you ever had anything worse than those same things?
Have I ever refused to eat anything? I think this has to be my last answer because I think we gotta end things. I have refused twice to eat something. Both times I knew it was a trip to the hospital. I mean, a lot of times other people think it's a trip to the hospital. I've eaten these horrifically poisonous frogs that kill 30-foot-long crocodiles that no one in Australia will eat, but these Aboriginal tribes people. But if a grandmother is making it, I trust grandmothers. I don't trust the doofy Australian outback guy. So I ate them, and then they drove me to the hospital, and we sat outside the hospital all night long. I slept outside the hospital in case something happened to me, because my producer was so worried. But I have turned down a dish that was moistened with water coming out of a spigot in a slum in India. That it was brown sludge coming out of this thing, and they were stirring it into the chat to moisten it. And I mean, I just knew. And I drink water everywhere I go because I build up immunities and things like that. A chicken intestine, deep fried in the Philippines, was handed to me on camera, and it was discolored. And organ meats have to be pristine. I mean, you can get really, really sick on them. Old chicken parts that are from diseased animals can kill you. And I had to keep shooting that night. And I looked at this thing and I said, no, thank you. And it was that simple. Other than that, no. I would rather be a good guest sometimes than anything else. Sometimes I'm the only American these people have ever met and will ever meet, and I take that responsibility very seriously. There was a scene in one of our Cambodia shows in a floating village where there was human waste floating by the window, and the lady was cleaning the fish, and she took the fillet that had like scales on it and reached to the window and rinsed it in the water as the stuff is floating by. And my cameraman and my producer are like, don't eat that, don't eat that. And I'm like, of course I'm going to eat it because you guys aren't. And I don't blame you, but I'm looking at them and I'm doing this with my eyes like I'm eating it. And I ate it and I looked at the camera because I realized without a translator they didn't know what I was saying. I actually explained my viewpoint, which was if I spend a night around the commode, so be it, but I'm not going to offend these people who have nothing, no possessions except that fish, and they're making a meal for me and my crew. I'm eating the fish. And my crew tell horrible stories of me making them eat things because I don't want them, to be rude to the lady who is serving us something god-awful but has just killed one of her 3 animals that she owns to feed us lunch. So it doesn't matter what it looks like, how it smells, or what it tastes like. You choke that down. You're not 9. You're not 9, you're 29. And these people need to think well of us when we leave. And I think that's important. I think being a global citizen is the most important example that I can set. So probably a good place to leave it. Thank you.
So, Professor Weissman, thank you very much. Great class. Thank you, Andrew. Next week we have a good class, so show up. Bye.